I'm Chuck Osborne.
And I'm Michael Smith. Welcome to our podcast, which is presented by Assured Partners Investment Advisors,
where we talk investing and all things related in a way you can understand.
Woohoo!
This is Chuck.
This is Michael. It's Thursday, August 11th, 2025. This is the 21st episode of our podcast. Chuck, what is on your mind?
Well, data, Michael. Data, and the fact that data sometimes lies to people.
Yeah, okay. Context is important, as they say. So,
yes.
Yeah, this can go a lot of different ways, but why don't you start it off?
Well, of course, just this past week, we had a issue with somebody sent some data on employment that the president didn't like, and she's now lost her job. So, if you don't like the messenger, kill the message. Or excuse me, if you don't like the message, kill the messenger.
Yeah,
got that wrong. But that led to a lot of questions about what's happening with the data around GDP, employment, all of those kinds of issues, because we've gone from the first quarter of 2025, which was finalized at down 0.5% in terms of our GDP growth. So we actually shrunk by half of a percentage point. And then the very next quarter, we get 3% GDP growth on the initial reading. And we've learned kind of the hard way of how government data works. The first announcement is not a proclamation. It is an estimate. And those estimates do change over time. So for GDP, for example, there's two estimates and then a final reading that is put out every quarter, and even the final reading may be revised, as more data comes in, which it does over time, because a lot of these things are based on surveys and so forth. And the same thing with unemployment. So the unemployment data that we quote every month actually is an estimate, and then it does get revised over time. And sometimes, it could be a year or two later you get a revision. So
yeah, and we're seeing some big short-term revisions now. I mean, it's much larger than you normally see in the short term, which raises some hackles on people and causes a lot of questions and helps our current president sack the messenger, as it were. But another thing that's happening here is that you've got a lot of people out there that are saying things like, 3% GDP growth, and we're off to the races. Tariffs weren't that bad. There's a lot of secondary things kind of going through the marketplace right now with people's views.
Oh, you're right. And this is where, what is it? The old saying, it's a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I think this is especially true for the younger generation, because we have a generation that is come of age during the age of analytics, and this is everywhere. I mean, you can't buy anything or even go to a restaurant now without someone immediately, texting you and asking you to rate the establishment that you just went to. And we are inundated with these survey questions and so forth, because everyone is data crazy. Sports has gotten this way where everything's about the data and analytics. And so, the danger of that is that people don't understand that the data can lie. And it reminds me of the old quote from Milton Friedman, who said that, any theory that cannot be supported by what he called facts, which data, needed to be rejected, but also facts that can't be explained by theory likewise need to be rejected. because sometimes there might be things that are seem correlated, but that doesn't mean they're causal, let alone even related to one another. So there are lots of issues there, and then the GDP data growing at 3%. Well, that's completely because we had a almost a shutoff in imports this past quarter, and that follows the quarter before, where everyone was front running the tariffs to get all of their foreign goods in the country before they had to pay these tariffs. And as we talked about then, imports are actually subtracted from the GDP calculation. So when you subtract imports from the GDP calculation, it makes the first quarter look like we were actually shrinking from an economy, which was not the case.
Yeah, we were not really shrinking.
No, we weren't really shrinking. And it makes the second quarter look like we're growing at 3%, which is also not really the case.
Yeah. The data is going to take time. It's going to take time for these tariffs and what's happening out there to make its way through, and for us actually to have any idea what the aggregate numbers really are. I mean, that's just it's going to take some patience to see how this works out.
And we don't have any patience, Michael. I mean, last week there were two articles. This is in the Wall Street Journal, so this, we're not. I'm not just talking about some crazy out on, in social media making claims out there, but in the Wall Street Journal, you had two different articles. One was pro-tariff, one was anti, both talking about why the tariffs haven't caused a recession. And of course, the definition of a recession, or the rule, is really a rule of thumb. The rule of thumb definition of a recession is 2 quarters in a row of negative GDP growth. We have had they just happened in April. It's only been 90 days. And then most of them were then kicked down the road because there was such a negative reaction from the market. So the tariffs, to a large degree, it hasn't even happened, and we're wondering why we aren't in a recession yet. Well, I mean, you need at least the 2 quarters to even have a recession. So that may be one of the reasons we're not in a recession.
That's also a rule of thumb. I mean, the point, rule of thumbs have been getting people trying to call things in this economy in trouble, truthfully, for a lot post COVID, because if you simply follow these quote unquote correlated data points, you would have thought a lot of things that didn't actually come to pass. And if you thought deeply about them, you probably could have come to an idea that, well, this is probably not going to happen anyway. I mean, it's been happening over and over again. I mean, from a yield curve inversion that has to cause a recession to, I mean, the point of a rule of thumb is that you use your thumb to look at what roughly is an inch, right? But depending on how close you need to get that calculation, that may not actually work. A rule of thumb, by definition, right, it's not going to always work.
Yeah, it may not work, and someone's inch might be longer than your inch. Yeah, but that's a great example, Michael, of and again, to my point of kind of the younger generation, most of the people I personally interacted with that were arguing back in, say, 22, late 22 and 23, that we were about to go into a recession. Most of the ones I argued with were relatively young in their career, and they're bright, and they know that, they crunch data, and the data, like you said, they had this rule that every time the yield curve inverts, we go into a recession, and they never stop to think about why. And that's really the problem with the people that become data crazy, is that they don't ever bother to understand the why behind the data. And the you know um you know in the past, the yield curve has inverted for for various reasons, but oftentimes it is because the Fed is aggressively raising interest rates in order to uh, to um, to slow inflation, which actually then causes um a recession. And at the and then people are thinking in the future that economic activity is going to be lower, and therefore will take a lower yield on the long term. That's kind of the theory behind the yield curve predicting recessions. But so much of that is also based on everything else that's going on in the economy.
Yeah, you've got to look at the entire thing.
Right. And you've got to look at the entire situation. It's also based on the idea that the Fed starts raising rates kind of late in the economic cycle. As we talked about, we certainly had a recession, in 20 with COVID. There were the 2 quarters in a row of negative GDP growth in 22, and talk about revisions. One of those has actually now been revised to be like
Revised away.
zero. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean barely positive, but a positive nonetheless.
yeah,
But none but it's clear in 2022, and no one can argue that we had an earnings recession
yeah.
with corporate America. You know, and the so we're really coming from a very weak point in the economy, and we had inflation, but inflation was caused by a lot of missteps on how we handled the COVID virus. Not just here domestically, but globally. um, and which in hindsight we now realize were wrong. But they basically it goes to supply and demand on that standpoint, and this is something that economists seem to have forgotten. I don't know if this is true or not. I've heard that they're not even teaching supply and demand and price theory anymore in economics, which is, if that's true, that's really a shame because it's the only thing in economics that actually holds up. But the you know we had inflation back then because you had enormous pressures on the supply of goods and services, not the least of which were actually shutdowns. um, and then at the same time, you had all this stimulus impact um, on demand. So demand was high, supply was low, prices are going to go up. That's what happens. And so the Fed had to react to that. Um, this was different than the Fed reacting to an economic boom that has gotten out of hand and
Hmm.
is close to ending anyway, which is typically when they are raising interest rates. And so, the idea there is, again, it's not enough to just know the data. You have to know the why behind the data, and you have to know why certain things actually occur. Um, and I think about this as we used to talk about this years ago when we first started our capital. We talked about the fact that information or data is available to almost anybody. Even then, the internet, and certainly now with AI, anyone can get any data in the world just by a few keystrokes on their computer. So there's nothing unique about having a lot of data. Knowledge is a different thing than just data. Knowledge means that you have some understanding of what the data is actually telling you. You can understand how to interpret the data, um, and that's a different step. And it's not quite as prevalent as the data itself, although it's still fairly easy to obtain. The last step is wisdom, which is that combination of knowledge and experience that that can teach you really how this works. And we are missing that in a world that is solely driven by data without any understanding of context or the why of the data.
Well, and sometimes the ideas too, it's funny, and it's a wisdom thing, but they're simple first principles ideas almost always in these things. Like we're talking about a specific thing, but let's talk about going into a recession and the worry. You know, what is a recession, right? It's a sustained downturn in economic activity, and it actually has to impact people. And what that means is it's almost always jobs, right? What's the most
Right.
important thing that has to happen? It's almost not a recession if at the end of the day you don't have significant layoffs and people are out of jobs. If people are still working and they are able to continue to pay and buy things, it's not really a recession. And so at the end of the day, if you have these numbers that are floating around and they're impacted by COVID, and everyone is still working and has jobs like they did, well, you're not going to have a downturn in the same way you think about it that turns things down. And that's happened over and over again in the last 3 years, that you're just not seeing job losses. If you don't see job losses, it's not a recession how we think internally the pain of a recession comes from.
No, you're right. You're right. We aren't seeing that and haven't seen that, and that's
Haven't seen
part of why we haven't that's why we did not go into recession in 23 and in 24. Um, you know, and but now all of a sudden we are starting to see, and this is something regardless of the adjustments that the administration didn't like certainly made this worse. But even the original estimates of jobs that came out for the last 2 years, we have not been creating the number of jobs that the United States historically has created or needed to create in order to sustain an unemployment rate. And so, what do I mean by that? In plain English, every month the job numbers comes out and it tells us how many non farm payroll jobs were created. And for most of my career, the rule of thumb on that is that we needed 200,000 non-farm payroll jobs in order to just maintain the a level playing field, because
As
that
new people hit the job market,
right.
right, as immigrants and whoever comes in, as all the
Right.
different ways that come in,
Yeah.
you needed a net 200,000 jobs to keep the unemployment rate where it was, not getting worse.
Right, exactly. Just, college graduates, people entering the job force for the first time, as you say, legal immigration, immigrants, and also just turnover. I mean, because there's a natural amount of turnover,
Mhm.
so there are going to be jobs lost. So you need to have new jobs to replace those jobs. And the again, this is a rule of thumb, but we've usually said that you need about 200,000 a month in order to do that. In the last 24 months, um, you know, 18 of the months we have failed to get that many jobs created.
Mhm.
And that's before all the revisions that brought that number even down lower. So, um, and we can talk about that as well, but I think there's lots of people talking about that. That a lot of that just has to do with the survey fatigue. As I mentioned earlier, and I know I'm sick and tired of it. I don't want to give feedback every single time I do anything on a given platform, and but that's what everyone's trying to get you to do. And because everyone's doing that now, when the government surveys employers, because that's where most of this data we get comes from, is the government reaches out to business owners and says, "How many people did you hire this past quarter? Would you please tell us?" And a lot of those requests are just being ignored now. I mean, the
Yeah,
people aren't responding. We had one of our own clients call me up and say, "I've asked, the government asked me all these economic questions, and I'm not an economist. I don't think I'm qualified to answer this." And I'm like, they just want to know what you've done at your actual business.
yeah.
This is where the economic data comes from. And when employers don't respond to those surveys, you get bad results.
There's nuance here too, though, in that the demographics of this country have changed dramatically, right? So one thing is we're getting older, we're having less children, there are a lot less people hitting the workforce. Immigration, we know right now there's a lot of changes hitting immigration on the illegal side. Obviously, that's doing it, but that's also affecting legal immigrants who feel less safe. And it looks like there's data that some of those people are leaving, whether they should or shouldn't. And so there is a nuance here that 200 maybe is not the number anymore. If it's not 200, the economy is worse off than it was before because it should be 200. But regardless, right. I think it's safe to say that we're creating less jobs than we probably need to. That's clear, but how big, that's a question. But we aren't laying people off yet. And I think that's where we are in this moment. Layoffs aren't occurring. For it to really be bad, we're going to need that to occur. Definitely not probably creating the number. Who knows what that number is with the craziness going on with immigration and whatnot. But it doesn't look good here. Now, whether that's actually, recessionary or not, that'll be a question, but it doesn't look great.
Well, right, Michael. You are right about that in terms of there are a lot of people out there who think we don't need as many jobs as we don't have to create as many new jobs as we did in the past because of you've got kind of a trough in the demographics and in the population. The problem with that, though, as from our standpoint as kind of investing in the markets and investing in the United States, is that whether that's caused because of demographics or whatever, it's still a slowdown in economic growth.
Yep.
No matter how you cook it, it's going to be a slowdown. And yeah, the official unemployment rate may not move that much because of it. But if the economy does slow down, then eventually, not right away, but eventually you're going to have corporate earnings slowing down. You're going to have stock prices not going up as much. I mean, it just, everything that is tied to it, that's not a good thing.
No.
And so it's still something that we should be concerned about, even if we have a demographic situation where that doesn't cause the unemployment rate to go up all that dramatically. You still have a situation where we're just not performing as an economy and as a nation as those of us that grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s were accustomed to. And we kind of defined as this is American exceptionalism, and are we still going to be that, or are we going to become Great Britain? So
you would need productivity growth significantly higher to bridge that gap. And there's obviously a narrative out there that it could potentially come from AI, but it's early in the game for that to be large enough to move the needle. Because you need productivity growth, you need new entrants to the workforce. Those are your kind of two big pieces that could do that. One of them we know is negative. Maybe productivity can be better, but that's a big question here still.
Right. Yeah, and yeah, I'll just add to that we the last technological breakthrough that we had before AI was just the internet boom, and we had a huge increase in productivity then as well, coupled with a growth in the population, and it was right kind of at the tail end of that where the millennials started to actually come along as being of working age and entering the job force, workforce, and so forth. And so you had again, that's what we're accustomed to in the U.S. Is we are accustomed to having technology providing a breakthroughs in productivity and
And yeah, and,
demographics being positive. And so, obviously, if we get productivity growth from AI, that's going to help quite a bit, and that which would be great. But it's still not going to put us back where we're accustomed to being, if our goals are really to, as the slogan says, make America great again.
it's
it,
hard to
so,
see how you break out of the 2% slow growth we had for the 10 plus years post GFC. If you have good productivity but significant negative demographics, it feels like you could be back in that 2% or sub growth level. So we'll see, right?
yeah, no, yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. But the yeah, that I think we're going down a long way on just the economy and whether or not we're going into a recession. I think there are other things in terms of data
Yeah,
and
yeah,
the misuse of data that that are impacting things. Um, for example, and this is also in the news recently because Mr. Mirren has been appointed by the president to, you know, take fill the empty seat on the Fed Board of Governors on an interim basis until they appoint a permanent Fed governor. Uh, and he is a young economist that has kind of become known because he, wrote a paper that kind of backs up this whole protectionist, weak dollar, high tariff, uh, you know, world that we're trying to go in, and that's another area where, for those that have actually bothered to take the time to actually read that. Um, you know, as an example, I mean, just partway through the paper, he's talking about the current accounts deficit, which is the trade deficit, um, in the common vernacular. And then he just out of nowhere correlates that with the fiscal deficit. Doesn't explain that there, any connection because there is no connection actually.
yeah,
But the you know and then the argument becomes that um, we are in debt as a nation because of the balance of trade, and again, that's something that where you're looking at data just from the wrong direction. I think it misleads a lot of people where so much talk is given to the trade deficit, the fact that we purchase more from overseas than we sell to overseas, and that gives the impression because of that language that it means that we are being frivolous and we are spending more than we're making. But in the reality, and this also gets back to the earlier argument about are the tariffs going to cause a recession? Imports are approximately 15% of the U.S. economy.
yeah,
Okay, so if you look at trade that way, 15% of everything we spend uh, is spent on things coming from overseas. 85% of what we spend is things that are, either goods or services that are from right here in the United States. We are not actually spending more on overseas items than we're making or anywhere close to what we actually spend on domestic items.
yeah,
You know, we just happen to buy more from overseas than the people from overseas buy from us, you know, and um, and again, understanding that context. and understanding that, one data point uh, does not actually prove an argument. You've got to have the context. You've got to understand, and you got to understand also the why of what is actually going on uh, with international trade, or with the GDP, or with the jobs number, or I mean, heck, if we want to, really go down the rabbit hole, we can talk about whether or not you should always go for it on fourth down.
Yeah, spend 2 seconds on that one. I love that one. That's always great for me. Like,
Well,
to think.
yeah. So this is the poster child of analytics in sports. Um, they go back and they look at the data, and they say that football teams are a lot more successful on fourth down than they are on first, second, or third down. And they don't ask why. I mean, how in the world did this team that couldn't go 10 yards in 3 plays all of a sudden turn into a juggernaut that can't be stopped?
When we
You
put that in
know,
context, right, what we're saying is the data said, everybody's taking that to mean you should go for it more on fourth downs, right? That's
well,
what.
the data
That's what.
says you could go for it all the time on fourth
Yeah,
down
right.
because your teams are so much more successful on fourth down.
Yeah.
But there's a reason why historically, before people were paying attention to this data, that they were always successful on fourth down. It's because coaches only did that when they were practically
Yeah.
guaranteed, when it was fourth and inches,
Yeah.
and all the center had to do is move the ball, and they had a first down. Then
Yeah.
they would go for it on fourth down.
Yeah.
And then so they either went for it in that situation, or they went for it when they had nothing to lose.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and probably half of those scenarios where you got nothing to lose, the other team's already in prevent defense. They're not even really trying to stop you. I mean, they're just trying to keep you from scoring and wanting to run down the clock. And
Yeah.
so there's this context of why all of a sudden teams that can't go anywhere for 3 downs can all of a sudden become unstoppable. And so now, does that mean that coaches in the past perhaps were too conservative? Yeah, they probably
Maybe.
were. They
Maybe. Yeah.
probably were, and they probably could have gone for it on fourth down
Yeah.
more often than they did. But you still don't want to go for fourth down when it's 4th and 10 and you're on your own 2 yard line.
Well, and let's
Yeah.
Lane Kiffin, he decided to take that data in college football. He was like, I'm going to go for every fourth down. And, so I'm an Alabama fan for those out there, right? And it was very good for us when he decided to do that.
Well, yeah, yeah, those are the kind of things that are going to bite you back, and
Yeah.
it always comes because, I mean, heck, we go back early in my career, Michael. We had a thing in the stock market about the Super Bowl, and if the AFC team won the Super Bowl, it was going to be a down year in the stock market, and if the NFC won the Super Bowl, it was going to be an up year in the stock market. And for years, that actually
It worked for a while.
it worked, and it did. It totally worked. I mean,
Yeah.
and now there was a reason for that. I mean, the '70s was a really bad decade for the stock market, and it happened to be a really good decade if you are either the Miami Dolphins or the Pittsburgh Steelers, both of whom are in the AFC. The '80s was a great decade for the stock market, and it happened to be a really good decade for teams like what was then the Washington Redskins and the San Francisco 49ers. And, those were the powerhouses during those moments of time. The early '90s, it was the Cowboys. So the NFC just happened to have good teams when the market happened to go up. And obviously, that correlation broke down, thanks mostly to a certain team in New England.
Well, we still hear about it all the time, right? It's like when these correlations happen for a long time, then all of a sudden these rules became part of lore, and we have to hear about it for the next 30 years.
No, you're absolutely right, Michael. And again, that's one of those things that, yes, the data, if all you do is just blindly follow data, then you're going to be trying to manage your portfolio based on who wins a football game. But obviously, if you think about that for 2 seconds, there's no actual connection between a football game and the stock market. And but there's all kinds of things that can be hidden in data that can be misleading to people. And ultimately, I think this still boils down to what I said before: is that you have to you can't just accept what the data tells you. You have to ask the simple question, why? Why is there a connection? And if you can't answer that question, then just like Milton Friedman warned, then you just have to count that data up to being a coincidence, and understand that that's not actually telling you anything. And the fact is, most data is just noise, and
Yeah.
very little of it is actually news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to end it. So, as always, if you guys have any, please please share. If you have anything you'd like to hear, let us know. And we'll be talking to you again in about a month or so.
Yeah, if the data tells us to, Michael.
It says it's worth it. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Chuck Osborne and Michael Smith are investment advisors, representative of Assured Partners Investment Advisors, LLC, a registered investment advisor. All statements and opinions expressed in this program are based upon information considered reliable, although statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. Information expressed does not consider the specific situation or objectives of any person and is not intended as a recommendation appropriate for any person. Viewers are encouraged to seek advice from a tax or legal professional or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk, and unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed.